Thank you.
Oh, then we could get...
Okay, thank you and good morning everyone. We have an absolutely cracking panel here this morning, rock stars of this space in Australia. So representation from some incredibly important organisations when it comes to supporting DEI strategies and advancement in Australia. We do only have 30 minutes, so we're going to get straight into it. We've got a lot of insights to share with everybody today. And first off, we're going to talk with Manisha. And the topic refers to vibrant and progressive workplaces. So could you just maybe start by saying what you think some of the hallmarks of a really genuinely progressive workplace is?
Okay, so I have a question for everyone. Who likes going into work on a Monday? So for me, that's the hallmark of a vibrant workplace. It's a place we like to go in on a Monday. It's a place we like to go in. You know, if we're feeling a bit down, we go into work and we have a great day and it makes us feel good. Vibrant workplaces are places where we can be heard, and when we're heard, people listen. You know, it sounds like those two things are the same thing. They're sometimes a little bit different. And they're also places where when things go wrong, there are supports for us to help us make those things right.
Yep, okay. And Sam, you know, the work that you do in your role, you would see many organisations coming to you for support, trying to understand how they might set up an action strategy. What would you say are some of the pitfalls that organisations typically come across when setting out to improve diversity and inclusion?
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Funny you should ask that. Of course, we had that question in advance, so I did start thinking about this. But one of the two main things that I would say is first, the biggest pitfall is thinking that there's a silver bullet, that there's one sort of solution that's going to solve all of your equality problems, and it's just simply not that simple. I like the analogy which I heard once about there's a big difference between having a relationship with a cat and making a toaster. So toasters are very complicated to make, but once you work out how to make them, you can actually replicate them. So that's why we can go to Woolworths and get a toaster for $7. But thinking about equality is far more complex because it's contextual and it's not something that's easily replicated. So we sort of, particularly at WG now, we're thinking about how can we take the nuance and context that organisations are facing and make that real for the practitioners, such as yourself, who actually have to come up with the solutions to make change. And I think the final thing that I'd say is thinking less about where you would find those solutions and thinking about bringing together a coalition of solution makers. So traditionally we hear about diversity and inclusion specialists and HR specialists being the people who drive the change, or sometimes when you read those great reports, it's CEOs and boards need to lead from the front. The thing that's not in that conversation is the fact that if you have a look at the employee life cycle, it's the line managers who deliver that experience on a day-to-day basis. And we don't stop often enough to think about, we give them the information, but do they have the capability and the practice to be able to actually deliver on that promise of equality across all of those transactions every day? And I think that's probably the thing that I'd be looking at the most.
I really like that concept, a coalition of solution makers, and it goes to the, insight that we can't do this alone. Yeah. Amanda, your role, you work both with other organisations in your career, but also internally with the leadership teams at Accenture. So we know that leaders have a role in enabling and role modelling the culture of a workplace, but what does learning and development look like for leaders in this space?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things, and it's what you've just touched on, is inclusion as a practice. We need to build leaders' inclusion muscle. And, if you ask any sort of leader, they'd go, oh yeah, I'm fully supportive of inclusion, diversity, equity efforts. But they may not know, exactly what that means or how they do that. And so a lot of the leadership development practices, and I say practice, is around getting that foundational awareness and understanding, and that seems pretty basic, but people need to understand why they're doing what they're doing, where are they on the journey. So a lot of self-reflection sort of activities to understand where are my own gaps in my knowledge and my skills and capability. So again, to your point. And then helping them understand what is that vision that they're needing to go to. So a lot of the things that we look at, we've done a Leadership Essentials training, and within that, we've tied what we need them to do as inclusive leaders to our core values within Accenture. And what they do is they get into a room with other leaders, they understand what that core value is, they have kind of a shut the doors, close the blind type session, and they can ask as many stupid questions as possible so that they get it all out with their peer networks. And they are armed with the right sort of information, knowledge and experience. We then give them an activity to go and experiment so that they can practice these new behaviours that we're asking them to do. And they'll go out into their teams and they'll go and practice or experiment with their new behaviour that's centred around their core value. And then they'll come back and they'll share with their peer group around how that went. And what sort of adjustments that they need to make, because this is a journey as well, and we're not saying, oh, it's a once and done type thing. It's about the practice, it's about the continuous learning, so that they feel that they can then turn those behaviours into their habits, into their everyday, because otherwise you're just going to have your compliance checkboxing. And then another thing that we do is we track and we measure. So we've put inclusion and diversity into what we call our 360-degree value meter. And so inclusion and diversity is considered just as important as financial metrics around sales and revenue. And our leadership are recognised and rewarded on what they do in those places. And it's also teaching them around what do I need to be doing on the everyday? How do I look through our whole employee life cycle and understand what is my role in each one of those decisions that I can make a change today. Not just standing up at a town hall, and that's important in terms of role modelling, but also how am I standing up teams, how am I rewarding and recognising, how am I promoting, how am I hiring? So bringing it back to the individual and helping them understand what their role is in this.
You mentioned in there, the use of KPIs and targets and building that in equally to financial targets. I'm curious from this panel to hear some views on the role that targets might play in an action strategy for a progressive workplace. Does anyone want to jump in on that? Yeah. Thanks, Dawn.
Sorry. Look, I think with D&I, it's absolutely essential that you measure and you track progress. I think, within a lot of organisations, we can talk about how important diversity and inclusion is, but unless we're measuring and hearing the voice of employees, we're not really understanding the impact that it's having. At Pride in Diversity, for those of you that are aware, we look at LGBTQ inclusion in the workplace, and we have an instrument called the Australian Workplace Equality Index. Now, that instrument can be used to benchmark organisations against other organisations on how they're tracking, but it can also be used independent of all of that. It can be used just as a roadmap. What is current best practice saying, and how do we actually fare against that current best practice? What do we need to change? And I think sometimes we can look internally and say, we're really good at this, but it's not until we look externally what other organisations are doing and what the benchmarks are that we realise, well, hang on, we're doing well in that area, but we're falling behind in this area. And so I think that the benchmarks are absolutely critical to understanding where your organisation sits compared to other organisations. And please do not underestimate the value of those benchmarks for employees looking to join your organisation. D&I is so important to younger generations particularly, and they will use that as a measure of your culture. Not what you say, but what are you doing? Are you actively engaged in measuring your progress? And are you actively engaged in trying to improve your progress? And that is absolutely critical, not only to your organisation, but for those who are seeking to work within your organisation as well.
So I mean, beyond understanding where your organisation may be today and how it's progressing, taking that to the next level and setting a target to an executive to achieve a certain diversity mix, be it gender or otherwise. Manisha, in your work, you look at a lot of system design. Did you have any comments on that? Because I'm sure that those targets would be, you know, part of that whole systemic view.
Look, 100%. I love targets. I think targets are a really great way for organisations, particularly leaders, to see what often other people in the organisation see anyway, right? So we will often work with organisations where they'll say things like, you know, there's diversity, but I can't get any further than this level. Or I keep getting asked to do X or Y, which doesn't fit in with my lifestyle, and I know that that means that I'm going to have to not get to that level, you know. Or people think that success only means moving up, not moving across. So people on the floor often know what the issues are, but leadership doesn't necessarily. So targets are really good for that. The challenge though is when a target is set without people recognising that we need cultural change to go with the target. So it's no good having a seat at the table if you're expected to behave like everyone else who's already at the table. And if you're expected to speak the same way, wear the same clothes, work the same number of hours, and have the same mental health issues that the people who are already there are having. So we need to not only set targets, but actually go, the reason we're setting a target is because there is a bias in our system, and that bias means certain people get roles that other people don't. And it's not because of merit. Right? And so I think the two things work together, and why systems are really important in this is because the past and the way we've thought about the world, that system has us all the time. So how often have we been told, for anyone here who's been at school at some point, that, you know, Mary's great at history, but she just doesn't speak up in class. Speaking up in class has nothing to do with Mary's learning or understanding of history.
No one's ever said that to me.
No, never. No. You've got the opposite. But that's the reason why we're on this stage, right? Yeah. We've been able to work that system really well. Yeah. You know, so writing, not so good for me, but speaking, awesome. That's why I'm in the job I'm in. Because our system says that leaders are people who can articulate things really well on their feet. Okay? It's got nothing to do with actually doing the job. And this is where systems thinking really plays a part. And I think the other side of that is, A, recognising there's a systems issue, but also recognising that systems bounce back really fast. How many times have we seen organisations that try to do the right thing and it will work for 6 months, maybe a year, and then we'll bounce back? It's because our systems, we've seen that through COVID as well. We thought the world had changed, and it certainly has in some ways, but we're fighting to stop it bouncing back. So systems take time to change. We've got to change them a little bit at a time and know that we're doing that.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Can I just say, in terms, the first thing that you said is, I love targets.
Yeah.
Rarely do people say that, but that's fantastic. But what's interesting is that most organisations already have targets.
Yes,
They're
that's right.
already measuring things. And it was really interesting. I'm sure you've all seen the Champions of Change Coalition report that came out on power. And what is interesting about that is that now we're starting to have a conversation about power and where power is in organisations. And actually targets is part of that, because what we know is that in organisations, that it's actually who has the power, it's about what currency you get. So whatever currency is operating in that organisation, that is the thing that will get you power. So if it's making money, we target profit and loss, right?
Okay.
If you don't value ageing, as many of us women have experienced, you lose your capital in organisations and in society. So those two things actually come hand in hand. I keep pushing back on, we already have targets. Targets aren't new, but it is about really sitting down when diversity and inclusion is truly valued in an organisation. You won't get pushback on targets. It'll be exactly like your budgets, and those two things you come hand in hand. It's about changing the currency in the organisation.
And the language, you know your targets aren't working the way they should when staff, and I've heard this, I think we've all heard this, where someone is told, oh yeah, you've been hired on the women's target or on the whatever target, right? Rather than it being, oh, you've been hired because not only do you have the skills, but you need to help with de-biasing the products we're making, de-biasing the way we're working. That's an organisation that's healthy. It's recognising the value that is missing in the organisation that we're actually bringing in, rather than it just being, oh yeah, it's the women's target.
And I think, as you were saying, it's like, how do you educate around the right sort of language? And it's through those experiences and the employee voice.
Yep.
And so for organisations, it's how do you actually elevate the voice of your employees? And if you don't have, diversity representation at that board level, how do you, A, set a target to go and get it, but also, B, elevate the voices either through your employee resource groups and networks that create connection and belonging, but also provide insights for leaders and also the rest of the organisation around what matters for them and how something's being perceived and how a system is being perceived as well, because you don't really know until somebody says, hey, hang on, well, that system or how you're doing performance management or how you're hiring over there is impacting me in this way. And then you go and you have to change it. So the organisation needs to be really close to the voice of their employees to be able to switch and morph, adapt as they go through. And also at that board level, if you don't have diversity on the board, how do you bring in some of those voices until you get the right sort of representation at those levels? Because people or organisations try and do it through employee engagement surveys, and they might, scan their organisation once a year. That's ridiculous because things are changing every day. You've got new employees coming in. Like we had 2,000 new employees in 1 year. So your whole fabric of your organisation changes, and so their experiences are super important. And so it's investing in those employee resource groups, giving them a voice at the table, scanning your organisation more than once and having that pulse and actually getting that informal feedback through the organisation, but making sure then once you get that feedback, how do you actually then action it and show people that you're actioning it so the next time they'll come back and redo it?
Well, Dawn, I'm curious to find out, we mentioned ERGs, but there's also a role I think that expert organisations play in advising companies back into organisations. So you're at ACON, you do a lot of work with various organisations. How can companies think to engage with and leverage the expertise that exists in, there's numerous organisations out there that can support these strategies?
Look, I think that's really critical, because I think what we tend to find is within the organisations that we're in, we have a certain pair of glasses on, and we see the organisation as we see it. Organisations that do this stuff every single day, 5-6 days a week, 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 hours a day, are actually working across a broad range of organisations and seeing what's working and what's not working. And so we work across the public sector, we work across not-for-profit, we work across government, of course, universities and public organisations. And by running the index and working inside of these organisations, we can actually look at what you're doing and say, look, we've got an organisation that does this, this may work for you. And it really gives you, I guess, additional insight into perhaps areas that you're not looking at. So I think it's critical that we don't just focus on what we're doing internally, because it can create a very closed mindset. There's nothing more valuable than sharing your experiences and hearing your experiences from other organisations. And I just want to comment on what we were talking about a moment ago, if you don't mind. There's a great book that came out of the States not long ago called Leveraging Diversity, Changing the Way That You Think About Diversity. if you can get a hold of that book, it's really interesting because the book talks about the fact that we get hooked on targets sometimes, and nobody wants to be hired as a result of a target. So rather than saying, okay, you get a tick because you've got a target, you're doing the right thing, it's the good people thing to do, this book says spin the whole conversation around. Is that if you haven't got the diversity, what are you missing out on? If you have got a think tank of all the same kind of people from the same kind of backgrounds, from the same kind of schools, from the same kind of careers, you've got one mindset there. If you have not got the voices of a broad range of diverse employees, then think what you're missing out on. It's not that, yes, I tick the box, we're doing well here. It's like, oh, holy crap, sorry, what am I missing out on because I haven't actually got the diversity that I need to get a wide range of voices and ideas. And I think that comes from leveraging external expertise as well. But certainly I think we need to somehow shift the conversation to be from tick box target to what are we missing out on if we haven't got that, so when it becomes a need rather than a kind of a stigma that we need to rule by.
And I think the important part there as well, I so agree with you, is that we're going to get this wrong, and humans aren't always perfect. We're not always happy. We're not always well. And the more diversity we have in an organisation, the more conflict we will have in an organisation if diversity is working, because you're hearing different opinions. So diversity is a benefit, but it's not a benefit that comes without the hard work that goes with it.
I agree with that.
And I think we need to be careful about that, right? Like, we need to be careful for leaders who are scared and worried and they think they've been doing the right thing. We need to be careful for line managers, and we need to be careful for staff who we're putting in these positions.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because we forever quote the research that says that diversity is better for business.
Yeah.
And that if you've got a more diverse organisation, it's better for the bottom line, it's better for business. But in actual fact, the more diverse an organisation that you're going to have, the more conflict you will potentially have because of the differences amongst people. So diversity within your teams and within your organisations is great, providing you can actually provide an understanding of that diversity and how we work together. It's very easy for me to work with people who are like me. It might be very difficult to work with people who are not like me, who don't have the same views, the same opinions, the same level of understanding, the same backgrounds. And so with diversity, yes, we can bring diversity into the organisation and appreciate it, but we also have to understand how can we understand each other better. And this is why D&I training is so important. I mean, we run LGBTQ training, and do you know the only people that attend the LGBTQ awareness training are allies and LGBTQ people? Yeah. How do you get to that other group that does not attend the training to be able to say, this is not about changing your values, your beliefs. This is about understanding a demographic that you might not be aware of. It's about understanding differences in people. It's about understanding challenges that people may have. And more importantly, why we are doing this. This is not just a woke agenda. This is about people within the organisations working with teams that need to manage teams that are very different, that might have very different conflicts and views. And so there's a real skill in managing diverse teams as well.
And I guess on the back of that is that, you know, we aren't just focusing on diversity. Like, this is about inclusion, it's about belonging, it's about psychological safety. And so if I can come to work every day and feel that I can be me, and that I can feel safe in who I am going to be much better at work, and I will feel included, I feel like I belong, and I feel that I can thrive. That's the part that creates the productivity, the creativity, the revenue increase for the firms. It's not just diversity alone. Like, we could all run out tomorrow and go and get, so many odd people that have disabilities, but then if they don't come into the organisation, feel that they can come to work every day and they feel included and they can thrive, then we haven't done a good job. So it's bringing the ID&E together and making sure that it is, and IDEB as well. Too many acronyms.
Really interesting, just the discussion about targets, and here we are talking about diversity, and always the discussion is about the composition of your workforce and targets. So those two things have become synonymous, almost like caregiving and flexible work practices and women. But actually, your targets are far broader than just about the gender composition or the diversity composition of your workforce. So it's catching that kind of undiverse thinking and thinking about things more critically when you're thinking about target setting and goal setting and business planning, that you're checking your own assumptions. And because of that, the kinds of things that you're talking about, the lack of inclusion, for example, and the lack of support for bringing diverse people into your organisation comes from thinking very narrowly about those things. So if we were to set targets, yes, around recruitment, around attraction, so have a look at your candidate pools, but also the amount of fathers that are taking paid parental leave. What about your attrition to and from parental leave? What is it about your performance management, your promotion systems? Set targets around them. It's not just about who you bring into the organisation and who you keep. It's actually about the whole spectrum, setting targets around the whole spectrum that supports the employee's experience.
Can I just say too, our language is so incredibly critically important. And if you work in diversity and inclusion, or if you work in this space, think about when we talk about gender equality. So say, for example, your organisation goes out and it does a great big launch on Gender Equality Awareness Week. And you're talking about men and you're talking about women. Now, I work in an organisation when gender equality is about men, about women, about trans men, about trans women, about non-binary, about, where do you actually, your language, where does your inclusion language stop being inclusive? So we can use language sometimes, and the expectation is, oh, you're a D&I person, you're talking about gender inclusion, and I come to your event thinking that I'm going to be included in there, and all of a sudden I realise that you're only talking about a couple of types of gender. And regardless of what your personal thoughts may be, you have to realise that a lot of your employees aren't going to fit into that gendered box. So sometimes our language, when we're trying to be really inclusive, can actually be exclusive. So I think we need to be on top of all of that as well.
And what a great nugget of wisdom to wrap up on. We're getting the wind up here, so with only 30 minutes, unfortunately no time for questions. These wonderful panellists are all on LinkedIn, I believe, and if anyone would like to connect with any of us, you can reach us there. Thank you for the insights. I think it's been incredibly interesting to hear the different views from the different players in DEI strategies within Australia. So please join me in thanking the panel this morning, everyone.
As it's going red. I said, as it's going red.